The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good morning. Our speaker today started his life, his professional life, as an engineer, but discovered that he was more involved as an observer of the political scene. And so he established a newspaper in his hometown in New Jersey. I don't know what happened to that newspaper, but he went from there to the Newark News, and from there to the New York Herald Tribune, where he served as political correspondent until that newspaper died, alas. And he went on to a more viable paper, the New York Times, where he became, very shortly, the chief political correspondent. He's also been a political correspondent for NET, and is an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. During the recent campaign, he served as political analyst for WABC, and on the strength of his commentary there, Time magazine this week cites him as one of the handful of outstanding political analysts in the country. And it quotes one of his more astringent analyses. I won't tell you what he said because he's here to tell you himself. And I'm delighted to present to you Richard F. Reeves.
I have to start by commenting on the introduction. The reason I left engineering is I wasn't very good at it. I mean, it had nothing. And the newspaper I founded, which was called the Phillipsburg Free Press, and sold out 4 years later, is now the largest newspaper chain in northwest New Jersey. I sold out just before it became the largest chain. I was also very bad. Besides being bad at engineering, I was bad at business. And what they said in Time magazine, which I didn't think was the best thing that I had done during the year, involved Nixon and McGovern's effort to try to get Jewish voters, particularly in this state. And when what they quoted involved the fact that George McGovern wanted to make his major Israel speech in New York last June, and they lined up and he wanted to make it in a synagogue. And it took, and Howard Samuels was the guy who set it up for him here, and it took them 3 days to explain to McGovern's staff why he couldn't do it when he wanted to do it, which was on a Friday night. And so that I'm going to talk mainly about television and politics, and to a large extent, television is politics, or politics is television in this country at this time. And we may lament that, some of us may, I mean, who basically write for a living. The reason that I do television is really because my children think that then I'm important if they see it on television. It doesn't matter what you write or where you write, but the fact of the matter is that I think definitely because of television, that that the American electorate in this election was the best informed electorate in the history of the world. And I think that's pretty significant in terms of the fact that there is a lot of analysis coming out, particularly from liberal Democratic directions and from the McGovern direction, trying to explain the election in terms of the fact that people did not understand the issues, that the Democrats lamented that the Watergate issue in particular and other issues did not get across to the people. Well, I don't think that's the case. In fact, people knew exactly what they were doing, and they know more about what they're doing than they've ever known before. The fact is that while it might be nice if everybody read the New York Times and Washington Post, or read the New Republic or the National Review, or whatever your choice is, that before television, no one particularly read these things either. I mean, these things have very, very small circulations in comparison to the rest of the country, so that television has not hasn't subtracted from readership. It's only supplemented it, and most of the people who get their political information, good or bad, in this country, get it through television, and most of those people didn't get any political information before, or they would get what little they'd happen to stumble across. So that I don't write off the American people. I do believe in democracy, and I think that this election was democratic. One of the things I did during the election was to at the end, was to live for a couple of weeks in one election district, 620 voters in Queens, in Bayside. And those people, most of whom do not read, knew a great deal about the election. They had their own impressions of the candidates, and those impressions were generally valid. That district, incidentally, is roughly reflects the city of New York, is about 2/3 Catholic, some Protestant, and maybe a quarter Jewish. And that district, which did exactly what, in many ways, this part of the country did, had gone for Hubert Humphrey by 20 points in 1968, and this year they went for Nixon by 20 points. They're 3-1 registered Democrats. And they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what Watergate was. Watergate didn't mean anything to them in the context of other issues. They were voting against George McGovern, and they knew why. And they'd gotten that information from television. And because television has become reality in our lives for most people. I went to the first convention, national political convention I went to with the New York Times was the 1968 Republican Convention in Miami Beach, and it was really a kick for me. I was a kid out of New Jersey, basically, and I was not only there to cover the national convention after having just watched them on television in little towns in New Jersey, but I was there for the New York Times, and I was working for Harrison Salisbury, who was kind of a legend in the newspaper business. He was then the national editor of the New York Times. And when I got there, when I got to the floor the first night, I found, and the podium is there, and the press stands go off to the side. We were on this side, and Harrison Salisbury was sitting there with a little Sony in front of him, watching the thing on television. And for the 4 days of the convention, he rarely looked up from that television. I mean, it was all there, but he didn't look. And in fact, you find out that the reality of the convention is not what happens on the floor. It's what's transmitted on television that makes the difference. And that is true in large measure of everything about American political campaigning at this time. And I'll mention a couple of incidents, some that happened during the campaign, one that happened to me yesterday. I was in March. I was in Concord, Massachusetts, with George McGovern at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution there. It's a 70-year-old prison. And the way politics really works, as the way it appears to work to most people, I thought was fairly well represented there. McGovern came to tour that prison. He met the warden at the gate, and we went through the prison, and McGovern and some press. We went through like 12 minutes. You go, that's what it means touring something in American politics. And McGovern went through, and he was walking through the warden, whose name I've forgotten, and he's asking the warden questions. He said, how many men do you have here? The guy said 300. He said, how many should you have in an institution like this? What would be the ideal size to do any kind of rehabilitation job? And the warden said, well, he said 100, maximum 150 is the most you can really deal with. And McGovern nodded. He asked some other questions about the same questions anyone here would ask who knew nothing about prisons. And we went back into some kind of meeting room in the prison, and the television cameras were there from Boston and from the national networks. And McGovern is kind of standing there nodding, and he hasn't talked to the warden again. And the lights go on. And McGovern says, I've just toured the Massachusetts Correctional Institution here, and I want to say that there are 300 men in this prison, and that I believe that the maximum size for a prison like this should be 100 men, maybe 150. And I'm sure the warden here will agree with me. And the cameras swing to the warden, and the warden's going like this. And that was it. And then the cameras go off, and that's what the American people saw last night. Well, George McGovern didn't know a damn thing about prisons. But the reality of what happened at that prison was whatever went over for 40 seconds. Months and months later, last month I guess, I was in Laredo, Texas with the president. Being with the president, incidentally, means that you are somewhere about 400 feet away from him with the United States Army, Secret Service, and FBI between you and him. It is conceivable at this point in time that there could be an imposter standing in for the President of the United States for as much as any of us know, who follow him around. But the president was in Laredo, and they lined up 30 customs agents who, after all, worked for him. And he started off by saying that he and his wife had spent their honeymoon in Mexico, and that they had come back through this customs station at Laredo on their way back home to California, which was kind of interesting because he said the same thing in Tijuana, which led us to conclude that maybe they went back and then came up through Tijuana again. But since there was nobody we could ask, Ron Ziegler said he wasn't going to comment on that. And Nixon got on, the television cameras went on, and he gave this little speech to the customs agent. And the substance of the speech was that narcotics was a great problem in the United States, that the Nixon administration was doing tremendous things to stop that, and that part of it was this emphasis on stopping drugs coming in from the border, which is what the entire country saw on television that night, which is fine as far as it goes. However, no one on television reported that the Nixon administration has cut back on the budget for customs stations so that there were a lot less people there, a lot less guards, stopping a lot less traffic than they used to do, or questioning whether, in fact, that is an effective way to deal with the narcotics problem. Last night, it happens that I've been traveling around since the election with one man who wants to be mayor of New York, Mario Biaggi, and he was at, and I just made a point of watching it because there was something I wanted to write about it. There was a demonstration at Gouverneur Hospital, the old Gouverneur Hospital, yesterday morning, and Biaggi, who is very interested in mental retardation, was there. He has a nurse who works at a daughter who's a nurse who works at Letchworth Village, which is what got him interested in it. And television was there, and Channel 7, which I sometimes work for, was there too. And so there was some kind of I watched it on television. If you saw that on television last night, you saw a confrontation on the hospital steps between the community, which was parents and a couple of kind of professional organizers, and the doctor named Rosner, who was the director of that hospital. And they had their confrontation, and it really appeared to be quite a thing. If you weren't there, it did. I mean, what you saw on television appeared to be quite a thing, because when you take the world and put it down into a size this small, it really has much more impact than in person. In fact, it was 15 people milling around. But and then they did the report. Doug Johnson, the reporter, did a stand-up report, said that we had this confrontation here. The parents are angry. They want to fire the nursing director, who's a woman named Margaret Duffy, and they want to fire Dr. Rosner. Then they demanded their resignations and whatnot, which in fact they had a press release saying they were doing. They then went, and that's what appeared on television that night. and that was, everything was true. I mean, film does not, in essence, lie. What the film showed happened. And they left at 8:30 in the morning. The parents who were there and the hospital people met until 12 o'clock noontime. And during that time, they really had, I mean, it was, to me, a really educational discussion on what treatment of brain-damaged children is like in this state and how it's handled. And that was, by the way, and perfectly clear through that discussion that this woman, Margaret Duffy, the only registered nurse for 186 children, who have been there temporarily for 10 years, the way politics really works is that these kids were from Willowbrook, and 10 years ago, Bobby Kennedy had gone into Willowbrook. He was trying to embarrass Nelson Rockefeller at the time and made a fuss about Willowbrook, and they had tried to reduce the population, as they're again trying to do because there's another fuss about Willowbrook. And they had brought these kids over to Gouverneur, which was then emptied for the new hospital. And it was obvious that it became increasingly obvious that this nurse, civil service nurse, about 60 years old, was really one of the heroes of our time. I mean, nobody else gave a damn except for the half hour the television was there, and this was this woman's life. And everybody agreed to that, all the parents, and they finally agreed after 4 hours of meeting and knocking it back and forth what they would do, and that the parents would go in as volunteers. The state will not provide money, and by the state I mean you. Taxpayers are simply not going to put up money for physical therapy for brain-retarded children, most of whom don't live through their teens or 20s. And that's the way it is, whether we like it or not. And that these people would do, the physical therapy is terribly important because the kids' muscles contract and whatnot, and they incredible and sad distortions of their bodies. And they agreed that the state wouldn't provide the money, that the parents, that Miss Duffy would work with the parents to set up to let them do physical therapy. Only 10 or 20% of the parents, by the way, ever visit their own children in institutions like this, ever. I mean, they just put them there. I mean, that's what really happened, but that is not what happened if you watched television last night. What happened was there was a confrontation, and these people were presented somewhat as villains. The people who have given their lives to taking care of other people's problems for very little money, if anyone knows what nurses are paid in this country. So that it does, television, it always distorts the news, because the fact of the matter is people act differently when a television camera goes on. You only have to travel with Hubert Humphrey. I mean, people don't know that Hubert Humphrey, like any other politician, except he happens to be more blatant about it, when the television camera comes on, goes like this. Hubert Humphrey's chin is always up because his whole face kind of sags down. Most of our major politicians wear makeup all the time. George McGovern carried a compact and would always be doing whatever one does. I mean, that has become a way of life. So has plastic surgery for American politicians, by the way. That is part of the demands. Also part of the demands of the system is that many politicians use amphetamines to a rather heavy extent. I mean, it's the only way they can keep up that kind of pace, I guess. So that television does essentially distort the news. The media always distorts the news. I once worked for the Newark News during the time when Newark became a black city, and it was the policy of the Newark News then. They stopped taking photographs of parades in the city of Newark because they didn't want to show that all the marchers were black, and they would not show black faces in parades, so that in the end they were showing just headshots of spectators. They'd find white spectators and take pictures of them because they didn't want their advertisers in the suburbs to know, this was before the riots, that Newark had become a black city. They wanted them, if they could, to think that Newark was still the way they had remembered it. And my own feeling about what happened this year and the role that television played in this election was that in effect there was no election campaign, not because Nixon didn't campaign, which he has a perfect right not to do, but because the televising of the Democratic National Convention essentially decided the election. That there was no way after that convention that George McGovern could be elected president because of the image, which was essentially a correct image of the makeup of that convention and the rhetoric of that convention, which drew a line across America. And most of the people of this country, the people who work for a living, usually the husband and wife works for a living, they're usually registered Democrats, simply felt that they were on the other side of that line, that it was fine to talk about women's rights and minority rights and all of the concerns of the most affluent part of America. And the most affluent part of a society has always been interested in the underclass, but rarely in the middle. And at that point, they simply left the whole middle of the country out, and there was no way that George McGovern was ever going to get. George McGovern challenged and had contempt for their lifestyle, their value system, the way they were bringing up their children, and the things they did for a living. That was their perception of it. And after that, he simply did not have a chance. These people had no great love for Richard Nixon, but at least he represented the country as they knew it. So that I thought that the single significant event was, I thought, the televising of the Democratic Convention. And at the Eagleton thing, when I was in Queens, for instance, and in a lot of other places in the country, but I particularly cite Queens because it's so far away from it, the people out there talked much more about Richard Daley being thrown out of that convention than they talked about Eagleton being thrown off the ticket. Richard Daley represents a great deal to middle-class Catholic America. And the Eagleton thing, I came away with a conclusion, and I would suspect that if people like the Michigan Survey Research Center do polling, they're going to find out the Eagleton thing really did not have a great effect on the election. That the people who said that Eagleton had a great influence on their thinking were only looking for some kind of rational explanation for what they had decided to do anyway. It was just a confirming issue. At their convention, the Republicans, who understood television much better, it's hard to say the Democrats understood television very well when it's perfectly obvious. They put the most important speech of McGovern's political career on at 3 o'clock in the morning. Simply because they did. But the Republicans, of course, can be criticized for it, but they used the medium well. Had a producer from NBC named Fred Reinstein who literally programmed their convention moment by moment. And they programmed it just the way that Carol Burnett does her show. And it worked for them. And that, they created their own reality for the country, and it was acceptable to the country. And that really is the way the world works. I had lunch the other day with Jerry Kretschmer, who's also planning to run for mayor. And I don't know anybody who isn't planning to run for mayor. And Kretschmer was talking about, there was a lot of television footage and still photographs of him climbing this pile of garbage. And he was talking about the fact that they were sitting around the office figuring out how they could get on television that week and dramatize the fact of how much garbage is collected. So they decided they'd pile it all up. They don't collect on my street, but they got the guys out there piling garbage up. And as soon as he got there, he said, this is him talking to me. He said, boy, I looked at it. He said, what a picture it'd make. He said, and I said to Herb Ellis, who was the sanitation commissioner, we're going to the top of that mountain. He said, what do you mean we're going to the top of that mountain? It's garbage. He says, we're going up there. Well, this will be great on television. And they went up there. And he said and then he said, I've been on television at least once a week, every week since I've been commissioner. And he says, that's why I'm going to be mayor. And I said, well, how are you going to be on television next week? He said, I don't know, I haven't figured out yet, but I'll be on. He says, and the week after that. That is the way politicians think about the medium, and that's the way they probably have to. So that the question comes down to, the question about television and politics, though, is not, it really is who's using whom. Is television using the politicians, or are politicians using television? You have to go back in 1948, the conventions are terribly significant in a relationship between television and politics. In 1948, only 100,000 people saw that was the first televised convention. 100,000 people saw it, most of them in New York and Philadelphia. But by 1952, they had the coast-to-coast cable laid, and you could watch the television, you could watch the convention coast to coast. And television made a decision in those days that it was going to use the political conventions as its major showpiece for what it could do. And most of the technological advances of the medium were displayed first during national conventions. In 1952, they used the coaxial cable for the first time. It was the first coast-to-coast hookup. In 1956, among other things, they put Huntley and Brinkley together for the first time, which allowed NBC to dominate the news and advertising revenues for the news for almost 20 years. They used things like split screens, creepy peepees, and whatnot. The small mobile cameras were used for the first time, and all with a reason. If you look at the sales of television sets in the United States from 1952 on, there's a curve that goes something like this, and each 4 years there's a tremendous jump. They have used most of the color sets in this country were sold in convention years, because television would use the convention and promote it to sell color televisions. Almost all of the early advertisers on politics were television manufacturers themselves, Philco and Westinghouse, people like that, Zenith. That romance is probably coming to an end because television has gotten what it wanted out of politics now, the conventions, and in fact the action really is with pro football now for them, so that which tells a lot about the society too. So that we've probably seen the end of that gavel-to-gavel coverage of conventions and whatnot, not because the conventions are less important. They are they're probably just the same degree, but it's no longer important to television to use that as their showcase, as I say, because they have football that they can show on Sundays, Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays now, and that's where their action is. On the other hand, the politicians, obviously some politicians have gotten tremendous benefit out of television, but much more than that, the political system and the political establishment in the country has gotten tremendous benefit out of television over the years, because I certainly cannot prove this, but it's interesting that in a time, in a 10, 15, 20-year period where almost every institution in the country has either collapsed or deteriorated to a marked degree, that probably the most vulnerable institution in the country, the two-party system, has managed to survive that period. And I think a large part of that is that television, its emphasis on the conventions, which are, after all, in many ways 7-day commercial or 5-day commercials for the two established political parties, have legitimized that institution, or those two institutions, the Republican and Democratic Party, to an extent. For instance, if television gave live coverage with Walter Cronkite in the choir loft and Mike Wallace and Sandy Van Oker and people running around the floor at church services saying, how do you think the minister's doing tonight or today, whatnot, the churches would be in much better shape in the country than they are. I mean, the fact that television may be what may be preserving the two-party system as we know it up to this time, because it has served their purposes. I mean, the World Series is legitimate. The Super Bowl are legitimate institutions. As long as television holds them up, they'll do fine. When it no longer does, it'll be interesting to see what happens to institutions like that. So with that kind of power, and I don't think you have to tell anybody in America today what kind of power, anybody with children anyway, what kind of power television does have. I suppose the real tragedy of its relationship to the public affairs of the country is that it is such a secondary medium in so many ways. The best example of that was, or the story that best tells that, Tom Pettit, who's a reporter for NBC and a pretty good one, was in Alabama covering one of the Wallace confrontations, and he has told the story, he was on the phone with his producer in New York. The real power in television news is not with reporters, it's with producers. And the producer said, we see what's happening down there. the Times had a great story on it this morning. And Pettit said, well, we can't get the Times down here. He said, well, AP's got a good lead on it, and we can use. He said, well, we're not getting AP either, Associated Press. The guy said, well, don't worry about that. He says, because UP's got a good story too, United Press. And Pettit says, we don't get United Press down here. And the producer said, you mean you don't get the Times, you don't get AP, UP? How the hell do you know what's going on? And the assumption being that a television reporter could not conceivably know what was going on himself. And there are many reasons that even now, with some very, very good and very, very well-paid people, television is largely still a subsidiary of the print media in the country, and there is no reason for that to be true anymore. They spend infinitely more money and have more people than all the print media combined. But you can, if you do what I do for a living, you will find yourself often in bars late at night. In my business, no matter what you do, you find yourself often in bars late at night with television producers or reporters who, particularly when I was a reporter for the New York Times, who are trying to give you a story they've found out so they can get it in the New York Times, because they know that NBC or CBS will not use it unless their executives read it in the Times that morning. And that goes on. Of course, that also goes on with Time and Newsweek, by the way. The great power of the New York Times is that it is read by the people who make decisions at other newsmaking operations. Most of those people have come out of sales and advertising and things like that, having the vaguest idea of how you collect news or put it together or present it, and they depend completely on the New York Times. They won't believe it unless they see it in the New York Times. So conceivably, whatever happens, the Times will survive, although you can't always tell it looking at its financial statements. There will always be an essential distortion in television news, and it will continue, and it will change the country, whether for good or evil, I don't know. I mean, I have my own ideas, because it is a visual media, and the people who make decisions in television have to make them on a visual basis, so that they have to evaluate news on not whether or not it means anything, but on whether or not it looks good. Television simply cannot deal with questions like wage and price controls. I mean, there is no way to show that very effectively visually, and they will move, and they always move, away from stories like that toward things that can be told visually. And because of that, which politicians understand very well, they are captives of political campaigns designed for visual events. People don't really campaign. I don't know how well understood this is, but people don't campaign in the sense that they used to, of going around the country and meeting people. They make one stop in the morning, which is early enough for the film to be flown or transmitted back to New York for the 7 o'clock news, and that is really the extent of their campaigning. And Nixon pioneered that or did it best in 1968. He didn't even bother to do it this time, but he didn't have to. But that's all. McGovern was not knocking himself out during this campaign. He was his most hectic pace was when we would simply fly from one city to another to hit one television market after another. And as I happen to believe in retaining the Electoral College, partly because it's the only thing that will force national candidates to ever go away from major television markets. I mean, they will only go from New York to Pittsburgh to Chicago to Detroit to Salt Lake City to the coast. I mean, that's all they'll do, and they can reach most of the country that way, unless they're forced to go in and compete for the electoral votes of smaller states or states that are off the beaten track. So that it does distort it. The other thing that, even though they have not learned how to report yet in television, and that was particularly apparent during the Democratic National Convention, and also I feel for these guys. By the way, I mean, a guy like me goes around with a notebook and a pencil and often doesn't take out the notebook because he doesn't want people to know he's a reporter. I mean, no one particularly knows what we look like or who we are, and we can just kind of go around and eavesdrop, which is what we do for a living. Most reporters are curious introverts, and they take on the institutional cloak of saying, hello, I'm Dick Reeves from the New York Times, because they want to know things, but they don't really have the kind of personalities that allow them to go up to strangers and ask without that cloak. A television guy travels around with 4 or 5 assistants, cameramen and a sound guy, and a guy that turns that and whatnot. They travel in a second plane on campaigns, by the way, the television technicians. That plane in the train is known as the zoo plane. And that is the way it is. But and when reporters are in disfavor with the candidate, like Evans and Novak were in disfavor with McGovern, they are put on the zoo plane. They're taken off the first plane and put on the zoo plane. And so that the television reporter cannot be anonymous, and he cannot essentially report. He's often restricted to interviewing, and there is an enormous difference between interviewing and reporting. Interviewing is somebody telling you what they want you to know is going on. I mean, reporting is finding out what's going on, and these guys are almost helpless. And if you want to see, I mean, helplessness in this country is watching all of the television anchormen and the really big names in television like to pretend they are still reporters. John Chancellor was a reporter for the City News Service in Chicago, and late of an evening he likes to talk about how he drove his car over the curb in Lincoln Park to cover this fire and whatnot. And in his own mind, he wants to think he's still doing that, which is nice. Walter Cronkite was a reporter for UPI and likes to think he was still doing that. David Brinkley was from UPI. So that they all feel compelled at some point to show that they're still one of the boys, and they go out on the campaign trail. And I was with Nelson Rockefeller in the '68 campaign when Brinkley went out to cover Nelson Rockefeller, and which was nice. And Rockefeller got off and did his number, and the crowd cheered around. And then David Brinkley got off the bus, and the crowd just moved, and Nelson Rockefeller was left standing there. And they moved, you know. They wanted Brinkley's autograph and this and that and whatnot. And that's the way it is. I mean, Walter Cronkite cannot have the vaguest idea of what's happening, because wherever he goes, he is what's happening. There is no way that, and he loves, you know, to go into someone's home and interview them. Well, I mean, what would it be like if Walter Cronkite came to your home to interview you? You know, I mean, the event would be Walter Cronkite, not you. So that, I mean, they are prisoners of their own fame, at least insofar as reporting is concerned. And that does trickle down. I mean, many of the other guys, Mike Wallace, Roger Mudd, Cassie Mackin, are such personalities in their own right that people can barely relate to them. They just, so it's very difficult for the report, besides the fact that they travel with an entourage carrying 800 pounds of equipment and huge lights, so that it's going to change the world whether we like it or not, and it is changing the world. The other thing, the worst thing about it, which I've kind of saved for last, is that news is not an important part of the television business. The television business is about half advertising and half show business, and there is a healthy and inevitable tension between the news departments and the people who really make the money for television stations and television networks. I mean, we are dealing with people who very clearly understand that Flip Wilson is worth a hell of a lot more than Walter Lippmann. I mean, Flip Wilson, just by going on, Flip Wilson, who's from Jersey City like I am, by the way, can go on television for 2 minutes, and that is worth $3 million to the advertisers of America. Walter Lippmann goes on Channel 13. So that these people really run television, and so that television news has to veer toward pleasing advertisers. I mean, it is not the same thing. I've been in the control rooms of a lot of television operations. I was in the ABC control room for part of the time during Democratic National Convention, and the vice president of sales is running around like a maniac. I should say that's too far. He is running around, telling them to get the commercials on, get away from the floor, get the commercials on. Shooting par is the phrase for that in the business, because there's so many commercials scheduled every hour, and if they're not making them, they're not shooting par. And if it doesn't matter if somebody's being assassinated up there, the news director is going to have to answer for it if he does not shoot par for any program that he's doing. I mean, the reason we have weather on television, I mean, does anybody seriously think that people are interested in 5 minutes of weather? The reason we have 5 minutes of weather on television newscasts is that the weather is sold as a separate advertising package so that they can sell 3 minutes of advertising in 5 minutes. They can sell the beginning of the weather package, they can break for a commercial in the middle, and then the end. I mean, I don't know, I may not be typical. I mean, I only care what the temperature is and whether it's going to rain tomorrow, and all the maps and all that. That is not designed for, that's why it is that way. And and that has a trickle-down effect in many ways. And one of the worst things, the internal competition in any business is pretty tough. Any business where the stakes are high, but is nothing to compare with television because there's so much money involved, and of the way people are paid. Television people are paid by how much time they spend on the air. They are paid under AFTRA contracts, which are actors' contracts, and an actor is paid for how often he appears. So that if you have the exclusive story that in fact Richard Nixon is an agent of, we don't have any enemies anymore, or we say we don't, I was going to say, you used to say, a Chinese agent or a Russian agent, but it doesn't, now he's their friends. But if he is an agent of the Chinese communist, well, you get on for 10 seconds with that. Now, if you've got a great story about, I don't know, five-legged dog or something, and that takes 30 seconds and is shown twice, you're paid 4 times as much for that as you are for getting the story that, in fact, the President of the United States is a foreign agent under those contracts. It doesn't much matter. So that the anchormen who spend more time on camera are paid on scales that blow the human mind. These guys are quite secretive about their earnings, but they all earn in the neighborhood. I mean, on the scale of $1 million a year, and they do that because surveys have showed that people trust Walter Cronkite. They believe him when he says it, and if someone else said it, they wouldn't believe it, even though it would be the same guy handing him the thing. And that's a very marketable commodity here. But the competition among television journalists to get on the air is brutal, because they feed their families by getting on the air. And the worst thing in the world is to watch a television correspondent in the field who hasn't been on the air for a couple of nights. I mean, he is going out of his mind trying to figure some way to work a story so that he can get it on, or to get some kind of good film, which has led to the instances of news management, the kind of somebody has done something, asking them to do it again, and then filming it because that film will get on. And I mean, the television networks are very, very careful about that kind of thing, but it still does happen because men are ambitious and they're trying to advance themselves. So we will, and now most of the political focus of the nation now for the next year will come back in this direction because of the mayoralty of New York and the governorship of New Jersey, which are the 2 largest elections in the country next year. And so that the focus of politicians will, they are plotting at this very moment all over the city, figuring out how they can get on television. They're also figuring out how they can get in the New York Times, or how they can get the New York Times endorsement, those who want it. Because there are candidates for mayor who feel that the New York Times endorsement would be counterproductive in this election. But by that I mean candidates are right. The New York Times endorsement is worth about 80,000, my own figures, but about 80,000 votes and $250,000 in campaign contributions. And money is they got so much money in when Herman Badillo got that nomination last time that they had to sit up for 2 nights and put the money in piles to get it to the bank. And before that, Herman Badillo was absolutely broke. I mean, the New York Times endorsement means a great deal in the city, or at least in Manhattan. Those 80,000 votes are in Manhattan in a Democratic primary. But so that we are going to be bombarded. I get the first candidate, I think Sandy Garlick will announce within the next week or so. And then they will fall one at a time. Now, some of these guys are bluffing, and what will drive them out is they will not be able to raise money. There's a kind of vicious cycle involved. To get money, you've got to look like a winner, and to look like a winner, you've got to get money, and so that it comes. But guys will spin off, and a lot of people will announce for mayor who have no more chance of being it than you or I. But we are going to begin to see them, and there will be more and more coverage because the name recognition of the people who are running for mayor is almost zero. I mean, nobody knows who any of these people are. They have 4% of the New York population can identify them by name if they're told the name, and the only way to really boost name identification is television, so that. Howard Samuels had a name identification of about 18% in this state before OTB. Now his name recognition of about 78 or 9%, and that was just the constant repetitiveness of reporting about OTB on television. So that we're going to be bombarded with it again, and I hope that I have given you some idea of the kind of decision making that goes into politicians dealing with television and vice versa. And I wish you luck, because you're going to have to stay up late at night to see all those candidates when the street should be a lot safer, because there'll be a lot more people on them when the candidates start walking around. Walking tours, of course, like everything else, are designed for television because they're visual. They're much more visual than the guy sitting there saying what it is he would do. So the walking tour is essentially a television creation. So I will end with that and find out whether I touched the points that interested you, and try to answer any questions on those or any others. Yeah.
First question over there. Would you stand up, please?
Of the youth registered for the election did vote.
Right.
To a question of how much does the television media actually affect the young people who are at college? I got the impression that a lot of the university people don't watch TV that much. And part 3, the question of whether or not those people that did vote were influenced by or were not influenced by the e-voting situation.
Okay, let me answer the 3 parts in 4 parts if I remember them. One, of the youth who registered, less than half voted, which is, I would like to say, by the way, that there are 2 things I want to say in that, because you really get me off on other subjects. One is that the turnout was the lowest in any American presidential election in 25 years, across the board, which is a very significant story. The long lines and all that business about record turnouts is a tribute to the incompetence of the Board of Election, not to the number of people who voted. And so that, but the registration of youth in the country was over 60% of the eligible young people, as compared to 75% of the general population. To me, that is such an extraordinary, so then you would assume from that young people registered and voted less. But that would be the wrong assumption. That's an extraordinary achievement in this country, starting from scratch for that many to have registered. Because if all the adults had to start from scratch and go through the nonsense and red tape that they make you go through to register to vote, like, do you plan to be buried in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, which is what they asked students at the University of Illinois, I do not believe that 60% of the adult population would register if they had the chance. But when it came down to it, they did vote in lesser numbers by about 10% than the adult population did, which is not particularly to their credit. Although the other thing is, the second question was, do they watch television? If they don't watch television, then they don't do anything. And I say that from that is my own experience of teaching, not of teaching, from teaching, yes, but because I taught I teach at Columbia now, and I taught at City before that. But also, I used to, at one period, travel around a great deal speaking at colleges for the New York Times. And I came away, a lot of that was kind of a gripe period where people would gripe about the way the New York Times was covering things, and they weren't doing this, they weren't doing that, and whatnot. And it was perfectly obvious to me from those sessions that those kids did not read the New York Times. They didn't have the vaguest idea what they were talking about. And I didn't read a newspaper when I was in college, I know that. I had the impression most people don't. I think that my own impression was that they do watch more television than is generally agreed on. I mean, I better you should get information on television than not get information at all. I don't think the Eagleton thing was a significant factor in the election. I think that people used it as an excuse for decisions they had made already and on other bases. There are a lot of issues like that in politics that I believe in the polls, but on the other hand, the polls often distort things by offering people a set of choices and saying, which one of these made up your mind? And also people want to give some kind of intelligent answer, so they say, yeah, I did it on the basis of the Eagleton thing. My own impression is those people had made up their minds before the Eagleton thing that they were against McGovern. Yeah.
Do you think that is also true of the Jews who voted for Nixon, that Israel was also kind of just an easy reason for voting for him, and that their real reasons were something deeper?
I think that the question was whether Israel was a smokescreen for Jews who voted for Nixon who made up their minds for other reasons. Well, they voted almost 40% for him, which is more than twice as many had voted for any Republican before. I think that Israel was a very real issue for some Jews. I wrote about this at length, and when I say Israel I was the first one that wrote Israel was a smokescreen. I mean, that was my conclusion after talking to people. But that doesn't mean it was a smokescreen for all Jews. I mean, some Jews felt that there was such a clear difference in their minds between Nixon and McGovern on Israel that was an important issue to them. As to the majority of Jews who voted for Nixon, my impression was that they voted as Americans, that they voted for the same reasons for Nixon that a Catholic family or a Lutheran family next door might vote for him. That there were class issues drawn in this election, and issues of your basic view of culture and your basic value system that were of overriding concern to Americans. I mean, the fact that a voter happens to be Jewish or happens to be Catholic does not necessarily dictate his vote. It's easier to study people in groupings like that. My own feeling was that the quota issue was more important than the Israel issue in the voting of Jews, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, okay. It always puzzled Punch Sulzberger, who used to send me blue memos about it. The question was, how do people determine things like, or how can they say, Jews vote this way, Catholics vote this way, and that has an influence? There are a lot of people in this country whose business is getting elected to public office or helping people get elected to public office. And if those people can know anything about a person, They would want to know where his parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents came from. If they could only know one fact about that person, they don't want to know his age, they don't want to know how much money he makes, they don't want to know which party he's registered in. They want to know his ethnic derivations. It is the best. There are two reasons that it is used so commonly. The first one is that it works. That Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, blacks, Italians, Ukrainians, whatever group you pick, you can, within reason, tell how they will vote on a given race. And they've just done it so consistently over so long a period of time. The second reason is that it's analyzable because people tend to live in ethnic clusters, so that you can analyze voting returns based on where they live, and they live closer ethnically, interestingly, than they do economically. So that those are the reasons, and it is valid. Punch Sulzberger used to go bananas when I kept talking in the New York Times about the Jewish vote. But the fact of the matter was, and we were in 1970 election, there was a very sharp age line between first place Howard Samuels. This was Howard Samuels against Howard Goldberg against Arthur Goldberg in that primary. Samuels was not perceived as being a Jew by most Catholic voters. They did not know that he was Jewish, or they didn't think he was whatever they. I'm not saying people spend all their time thinking about these things. However, there was a sharp line. Arthur Goldberg won that primary because Jews above the age of 40 voted for him by a ratio of 8-1. He would have lost the election if that group was eliminated from the population. There's no other group you can isolate that way that votes. So it is a fact that you may not be what you eat, but you are where you come from and where your people came from.
I'd like to know, why was it so evident to the Nixon administration that they needed very little campaigning against McGovern? Almost from immediately they hardly campaigned.
The reason it was apparent was the
They didn't hear.
the question was, why was it evident to the Nixon administration that they didn't have to campaign against McGovern? Part of it was good polling data that which was essentially showed that people did not like Richard Nixon, but they mildly respected what he had done as president. So that Richard Nixon, the candidate, they disliked. Richard Nixon, the president, they could tolerate, was one factor. The other was good instincts, that the more McGovern campaigned, the more he would lose. And that, that may change American politics, because the press could not cope with Nixon not campaigning. We continued to, there were 100 reporters at Laredo, Texas today said that. There were no reporters back in Washington finding out what they really were doing about narcotics. And I would suspect that the press will react, I hope they'll react, the next time someone chooses not to campaign, to go into great depth about what their administration is really doing. And that, the New York Times should have been running a 12-part series on what the Nixon administration has meant to America and how they've dismantled administratively things. Those things aren't covered. Government is not very well covered in this country. Politics is covered much better because it's more fun, and that's a large part of it. So that they just had good polling data, and they had good instincts about the vulnerability of McGovern as a candidate. And of course, it was not an irreversible decision. If their own polling data had showed them that things were going the other direction, he would have come out and campaigned and tried that.
Why would the Democratic Party pick a candidate? Aren't they far-reaching enough? Maybe it's kind of an academic question, but wouldn't they be clever enough, or shouldn't they have been, to realize some of the things that were going to happen? I mean, don't they really bother to look into, or is it just politics?
Well,
New York Times. That was what happened to them.
the question was, yeah.
Is mediocre or controversial or something that's not going to get him even a chance to be elected.
The question was why would the Democratic Party pick someone like McGovern? Because the Democratic Party is a group of competing factions, and his faction won the competition. And what they will do is change the rules of the competition to make it less easy for what happened basically was that an organized part of America, the organized through peace, through civil rights, through to a certain extent the women's organizations, saw within the structure a chance to win just by sheer organization, which is exactly what Barry Goldwater saw in the Republican Party in 1964, and they were able to win the nomination fairly that way. And if it happens that they then ended up with a candidate who didn't even represent a majority of his own party, that showed a certain vulnerability in that system. As any, that's how Mario Procaccino became the candidate of the Democratic Party in New York. And no system guarantees that a majority is going to. There may be no. What I'm saying is there may be no majority within the system, and there was no majority to oppose George McGovern within that system.
There's a question over here.
I'm sorry.
In other aspects of this election, I think the voters, kind of surveying New York State, were tremendously sophisticated, passed a bond issue, defeated a fifth judicial, all sorts of things. In fact, my own congressional election is still up in the air. I don't know if it's Mr. Pizer or Mr. Ottinger at this point. How did television, do you think, if it had any effect on some of these, lesser things, or how did people decide on an environmental bond issue, judicial district? The president's coattails were so short they were virtually non-existent in many cases.
Well, the president, what is television's relationship to the sophistication of voters that was shown in? I think there's a self-selection process of the. First place, there's a tremendous fall off on the ballot, ranging in this election from 10% to 35%. That 35% of the people who voted for president did not vote down to the bottom of the ballot. So that the people who vote, particularly on questions, are on bond issue questions, referenda, are a self-selecting minority.
Even though this is across the very top.
Yeah, who do get information. My own impression, the reason I went to Queens was that I wanted to find out how people got their information. And my impression was that on local races, like at the assembly level, state senate level, and on the bond questions, that the major input of information was literature, distributed, and that had tremendous impact. And along with that word of mouth, which could be traced back to the literature. That they'd say, have you heard about these guys? And the person answering that question had heard about them from the literature. I was surprised, by the way, at the impact of door-delivered literature on local elections. It was much greater than I thought and part of the reason it's so great is that the one man, one vote decisions have in many ways been a disaster for representative government because no one knows who represents them anymore. And they have given politicians the power through redistricting every couple of years to make sure that certain things happen, and certain incumbents who have offended their constituency are in effect given different constituencies to run with to protect them, so that you end up with invisible representatives. And it's a disaster that we're living with right now. I mean, among the most powerful men in this state is someone called Donald Zimmerman, who no one's ever heard of. Donald Zimmerman is a computer technician who is paid $28,000 a year by Nelson Rockefeller, who runs computer tapes of election returns and decides where those districts are going each year, which is why John Dow is no longer in Congress. It's why Murray Schwartz in Queens is no longer a state senator. These people were simply redistricted out of business and put in places they couldn't conceivably win. And other Republicans were put in places where it was almost impossible for them to lose. And that was all done from computer tapes by this guy who
Your antidote was very devastating to paint, at least for me, about the half-truths that are given to our nation through the television politics. What's the antidote? Here you stand, an example of something sane in a really insane media. What are we to do to really get beyond these half-truths that are fed to our nation?
well, I mean, I'm flattered by that, but The question was, how do we get around the half-truths that are fed to a nation by something like television? I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I more and more think the last couple of years you either believe in democracy or you don't. And if you believe in it, then you've got to accept the fact that people act with only partial information. Yet my own impression is they act very rationally on it, and that they have more information than they've ever had before. And that I do believe that the American people, they may not the first time, but the American people can spot a phony, and they do it. There's a very condescending term. There is a type of peasant cunning out there that I mean, these people can deal with people in their normal lives, and they're fooled sometimes. But I mean, you know, it's like Lincoln said. You know, I don't think you can fool all of the people all of the time, and I don't think it will happen. And always, all of us, in everything we do in life, are dealing with part of the truth, and are trying to evaluate. I mean, what is truth? And I think the system works. I really do believe in the theory of democratic government. I think that. I mean, I have a more positive view of the same set of information than you do. I think, thank God, that people have more. I thank God for television. People have more information than they ever had before. In the old days, they would just vote a straight party line. The Democratic Party could put up a baboon, and a certain percentage of the country would vote right down the line for them. And or the Republicans could put up a thief, and people would vote right down the line for them.
Don't we get a less manipulated picture if we listen to the news or the radio than watching your TV?
No, I don't.
Don't you get more news than out of TV?
You may get more news, but I think that no, radio news, I think, is the worst news in the country. They spend no money at all collecting it. One of the things they do is that almost all the live feed-ins on political campaigns on radio are gotten by dialing a toll-free number where, and it's the political people themselves who are feeding that information in, and it's presented as reporting, and it should be a paid advertisement. Now, I mean, radio just puts no money into news at all and just rips what's on the AP ticker and takes whatever anybody hands them. Oh, I'm sorry, you should go to...
How do you feel about Anthony Lewis and McGovern's position? The underlying basic factor at work in this election was busing, an unspoken issue,
Right.
not discussed on the television, but very much on everyone's mind.
The question was, the New York Times has done a couple of things that I didn't know that Tony Lewis had written about it, but I know that Jack Rosenthal did a news analysis based on some polling figure and whatnot, and they have said that the real issue in this campaign was either busing or race, and that it was not discussed. I don't believe that. I think that race is always an issue. I think race is an issue in everything in this country. I think that, and that busing is an extension of that, housing is an extension of that, other things are an extension of that. But I thought, and I object, and Jack Rosenthal and I are very close friends, and he did that analysis first, and I objected to that and told him I did. That is an incredibly simplistic view of the way people make up their minds. The people who feel threatened by race in this society, and remember, most Americans have never seen a black man. You know, I mean, we happen to live in a part of the country where there's a heavy racial concentration. I mean, it's very easy to meet people from the Midwest who, except on television, have never seen a black person in their lives, or maybe a truck passing through, they saw someone. There was a basic threat to the largest grouping, the largest class of people, to their basic value and priority system in this election, and race was only one part of that. And I don't, not only don't I agree with it, but it drives me up the wall, that kind of analysis, because then we are going to say that liberals are going to say that, well, we lost this election, it's a racist, fascist pig nation, or as Pete Hamill says, it's a nation of used car salesmen. It is not a nation of used car salesmen. It's a nation of mothers and fathers. And these people are basically interested in passing along more to their children than they had themselves. And they reacted to a threat, what they felt was a basic repudiation of the American dream, which is a very real and live thing in this country, by George McGovern. And in many of the, I think race was probably a factor in many, many cases, and it was probably a small factor in everybody's decision. But that isn't what happened in this election. What happened in this election was that George McGovern represented a minority of the American people, and he got his brains beat in. And that's what democracy is about.
Well, we've exhausted our question period, and we should, but before you go, I want to explain that those lights were from educational television, and you see what happens to educational television. It gets turned off. Thank you very much for it.
Good.
For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.